So now that we've dealt with the different competing European powers and what they wanted out of it, what about the Africans themselves? Well, the European powers obviously still, as we said, had some colonies on the coast. And I think without there being a scramble for Africa, I think that, they would have pushed a little bit further into some of the interiors, especially where they found valuable resources. However, something to note is that the Europeans never really in-depth colonized vast swathes of Africa. And what I mean by this is the so-called Hinterland Theory. So hinterland, that's the interior of the continent. And so basically how this theory goes is that the Europeans settled on the coast and, they directly governed places on the coast, and especially like in the major cities on those coastal regions. But when it came to the interior of the country, they would basically bribe local chiefs and tribal leaders and stuff, and basically administer things in a kind of indirect way. So many people have this idea that colonization in Africa was this very direct, top-down thing by the European powers, where actually in most cases it was actually indirect rule, where they would rule through the local rulers instead of directly administering these places. And so in this timeline, we can expect to see a great many kingdoms still existing, much as in our timeline you had Ethiopia survive colonization. I think that you would have had many other places as well, such as the Sokoto Caliphate in northern Nigeria, such as Buganda in what's modern day Uganda, such as the Kingdom of Benin in West Africa, and also many other places. Don't get annoyed if I've missed out your people, right? There's many places to get through, right? So this is just, I'm saying, etc, etc. But I think that outside of the actual main coastal regions and outside the very mineral rich places, I think that for the most part, most places in Africa would have remained uncolonized. And actually something to note is that even to this day, if you look at a map of the population density of Africa, it actually centers around very few places, right? So actually, the vast majority of people in Africa actually live within a very small amount of regions, within Africa. So Africa's vast. So again, we need to get out this idea that Africa is just one country. So now we've gone through all the history of the process of colonization. Now let's look at what most people clicked on this video to watch, which is what are the effects of colonization on Africa. And actually, it might be quite surprising. In the West, we have this kind of common notion that the West got wealthy because it looted Africa, and that's why Africa is poor today and the West is rich. But in actual fact, it's something to do with what's called the Great Divergence. And this is something that we discussed in the India video as well, so definitely check that out of, what if Britain never colonized India. So what we have to understand is that the vast majority of investments that came from Britain went mainly to the other colonies, right? So it went mainly to the United States and to the White Dominions, as they were so called. Only 13% of investment from Britain went to Africa, right? And British investment in Africa represents about 3/4 of all the money that was put into the continent, right, from the different colonial powers. So this idea that the Europeans went there and they exploited it and they took all the resources, in some cases, yes, that was the case. But again, Africa is not one country. Africa is complicated. So in the Congo and in South Africa, yes, you can definitely make the case that white people went there, colonized it, exploited the people, were very ruthless, etc, etc. But for the vast majority of the continent, as we discussed earlier, it's indirect rule. So the Europeans didn't really have that much part. They would claim parts of it on the map and be like, right, this is French territory, this is British territory. But actually, in terms of administration, they didn't really get that involved. And we can actually see through historic records just how much of an impact or lack of impact that colonization had within the African continent as a whole. So in 1600, the GDP per capita of Africa as a continent as a whole, right? So GDP per capita is the average income of people kind of on a per capita basis, right? That in 1600 for the whole continent of Africa was $422, right? In 1700, it was 421. In 1820, it was just 420, right? So actually over this period of about 220 years, we can actually see that it's basically stayed the same, but actually it's gone down slightly. And this obviously, a lot of the data for this can be quite complex because there were obviously some places which were empires and kingdoms and very developed, and the vast majority of Africa was just tribal regions, right, which weren't industrialized, weren't urbanized, etc, etc. So it's something to kind of bear in mind here, that like over this period, you're talking, again, this vast continent, but as a whole, you see that it's actually stagnated and actually slightly gone down. Now, what about the period from 1820 to 1870? So in 1870, so a few years before this Berlin conference, right, it had risen from 420 to $500, right? And from 1870 to 1913, which is the point at which, you know, like nearly the whole of the continent was colonized, yeah, like this is kind of peak imperialism as such, as we can see from the map here. So 1913, GDP per capita in Africa was 637. So again, it varies from one place to the next, but yes, so $637, that's the figure. So we've seen an increase of 27%. However, when we kind of factor in the fact of, you know, this is a period of 43 years, that's not that impressive, right? That's like 0 point whatever it is, right? It's not like that impressive of a growth rate, especially when you compare to like Australia and America and all the other kind of white dominions over this time. You know, their growth rate was much, much higher than this. And so now we're going to skip from 1913 to 1960. You know, so 1960 is the period in which a lot of the colonies end up getting their independence. You know, so it starts off with Ghana in 1957. You know, and like they kind of springboard the whole thing. Actually, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, he's actually who I'm named after. So yeah, big props to him. Like, he's a really cool guy. Around 1960, this is when places like Nigeria get their independence. Many of the French colonies get their independence, etc., etc. And you know, throughout the 60s, like a lot more places get their independence, and finally the last one is Zimbabwe in 1980, right? But if we just take 1960 as a benchmark, we can see that GDP per capita in Africa, the whole of the continent, was $1,055, right? So in a period of 47 years, it's increased 65%. So if we look at Ghana, for instance, we can see that from 1870 to 1913, it grew at a rate of about 77% over that time period, which averages out at around something a little bit less than 2% per annum, right? So from place to place, it varies a lot, right? And places where the Europeans invested a lot of resources in, you know, obviously Ghana is very famous for its gold, which is why it's formerly known as the Gold Coast, and also for like cocoa, which is where people get a lot of their chocolate from, etc. So Ghana was an example of a country that was invested in a lot, and the GDP per capita actually grew there. Now, this is a separate conversation in terms of, you know, the inequality of this, right? How much of this was distributed amongst the people themselves. We can see, for instance, South Africa today, it has a very like wealthy economy. However, it has a huge like Gini coefficient number, which means that it's incredibly unequal, right? So there are some people who are very, very wealthy, you know, like the mine owners, like kind of gold mine, platinum mine, etc., etc. And then you got people living like below like the poverty line. So yeah, so that's something to kind of bear in mind, you know. But just taken as like kind of a meta for it, right, we can see that actually on paper GDP per capita growth in Africa increased over this period, right? So you can dispute the figures, you know, please in the comment section. It's not my figures, I'm just reciting some of the other ones. I'd love for people to like, you know, in a respectful way to provide other figures, yeah, that counteract this, and I'll be happy to do a future video on this. But this is just some of the data which I've found so far. So something to kind of note is that African colonization is not a clear-cut kind of thing, right? It changes from one place to the next, changes from colonial power to next. You know, like living in the Belgian Congo is very different from living in like, you know, French Congo, etc., etc. So these are all things we have to kind of bear in mind, and that a one-size-fits-all kind of narrative, yeah, is not really going to cut it, right? It's in the same way when we discussed about the British in India, it's the same kind of thing, right? It's more complicated than a lot of people try and make it out. And so if you like that video, definitely don't forget to hit the like button. You know, we're still going for that 20 likes per video. I really appreciate the people who have been hitting those like buttons. Also, watch a lot more of our other videos as well. We've got a great lot of content. Actually, just a heads up, we are going to be moving away from the alternative history videos at some point in the next like few months. It's like, you know, some people already hit me up already, like what if the Mongols invaded Japan, and looking at these kind of alternative scenarios, because once I kind of have finished this, I'm then going to be sorting out the rest of the channel, and then in a few months time I'm going to be launching the new thing, which is going to be film reviews, right? You know, so I'm a big film lover, and so I'm going to be, you know, looking at different films which I think have not just like objectively good and stuff, yeah, but I think like have touched the human spirit in like a different way, right? And also as well, there happen to be films that I've liked, right? So yeah, so definitely stay tuned for all that. And the next video is going to be on what if Shaka Zulu never existed, right? So we're going to be looking at the impact that Shaka Zulu had on South Africa, right? And you know, throughout like the whole South African history. So yeah, definitely stay tuned for that. And you know, in the meantime, have a great day and bye.